It's finally engine assembling day. It's going to be interesting to see how far I get before I realize I've forgotten something or don't have a part or don't know what I'm doing. But the crankshaft and flywheel and clutch I got back from the balancers yesterday. The flywheel had previously been lightened and the taper on the inside of it adjusted to fit the Arrows crank that I'm using. But I hadn't had it balanced. So this has all now been balanced with the crank. The rods are already balanced from the factory, and the pistons I've matched up the weights myself, but I'll probably re-look at that when I actually come to fit them, because I forgot to do that with the gudgeon pins and all of those rings and bits and pieces with the pistons. So I think what I'll be able to do is weigh them selectively and put together a nicely balanced set. But actually assembling this thing, I have gone ahead and fitted the crank. Ages and ages ago, you might remember I had to, I don't want to say machine because I did it by hand. I actually did it with a Dremel and some tungsten burrs, but I had to cut these little relief slots in the front housing so that the crank would fit through. And I'd played around a lot with the bearings to make sure everything fitted nicely. So that fits in there nicely. Having the engine stand so that I can rotate things around, so I can sit it up on end so you're not fighting gravity to install these things, actually makes it quite a bit easier. I should mention the reason that big tub is under there is because before I started I gave the whole engine a good clean down with clean rags, made sure it's absolutely clean. So I'm starting with a clean block. But the crank is in there now, so the next thing to do would be put the timing case cover in place. And this is one of those places where I'm not sure if there's meant to be a gasket there or not. I have set everything up without a gasket because the thickness of the gasket will affect things like the positioning between the oil pump and the housing. And it's one of these ones where, because there isn't a manual, it can be hard to know what is actually correct. So usually what I do in these situations is I go back to the parts book, and this is the Mark 1 to Mark 4 parts book, and it doesn't mention any sort of jointing gasket in here. So that's why I've gone with no gasket. I'm going to use modern sealer on it, of course, but it doesn't look like there's a gasket here. And usually when there is a gasket, they'll mention it. So this is the rocker cover gasket, which is specifically mentioned as a joint washer. Similarly, for the oil pump, it actually shows the gasket in the parts lists. So flange washer in that case. So going by that, I'm going to assume for this engine it's okay not to have a gasket. I guess the worst that'll happen is it'll leak oil, and chances are it's going to do that anyway. So that'll be the next step, is fitting that. I'm not actually going to film myself doing everything. I find that too annoying and I'm too lazy to edit it all later. So I'll sort of do it in bits and pieces and film as I go so I can explain. Remember, of course, I'm not an expert. I've never done this before on one of these engines. The only car engines I've ever assembled were the MGB engine, which runs quite nice and sweetly, and my Austin 7 engine, which runs, but I haven't had it on the road to know how well it's going to run or how good it's going to be over time. So this one will be interesting. I'm up to fitting the crank gear, which is this, which goes obviously on the end of the crankshaft. I've got the timing cover all bolted on. I used Loctite 515 sealer on the mounting faces, and I've just checked that the oil pump does line up. There's a gasket under the oil pump, and that the sealing ring here is able to be compressed. So it's kind of like a big O-ring, and that needs to be under pressure, obviously, to stop this leaking. And I've been able to fit the intermediate gear, which slides on here, and test that, yes, the oil pump does go round once you get the intermediate gear in place. It's got a pin, a drive pin there, and this is actually meant to be quite a tight fit on here, I believe. So obviously mine isn't. When I assemble this, I'm going to use some Loctite inside there. It can't go anywhere, but just to make sure that's a nice fit in there. But you can see with that in place, the little plungers for the oil pump move around easily. So nothing's binding up here, it's all nice and smooth. So that's good, that'll all go back together. It's quite handy that I can actually remove this, because it's made fitting the gear here a lot easier. So the way this works is there's a special thrust washer that goes in here. It's like a hardened washer, and that's to get the alignment of everything correct. And because my engine is a bit of a Bitzer engine, it took a little bit of playing around to make sure I got all of this right. One modification we've been discussing on the forum just today, actually, is because of the way the clutch works. Normally all the thrust when the engine's running is taken sort of in that direction. So the thrust is taken up inside here. But when you put your foot on the clutch, because of the way the clutch works, it's pulling, and it's going to pull on the crankshaft. So a modification people do is they fit a hardened thrust face or a special thrust washer on here, a sort of a pinned one, and that's to take up any wear that happens there. I'm not going to do that on mine. One, because the infloat and everything I've got is perfect without it, just with this washer in there. This washer is going hard up against this face. So when all this bolt is bolted up, that's what gives you the crank end float, and I spent a long time playing with that to get that right. I think it needs to be 2 thou from memory. I'm not sure of the exact measurement. But the other thing is, this mod is being done on engines which have done thousands and thousands of miles, I'm guessing. So realistically, I don't think wear is going to be a problem for me in there. And to be honest, if I drive this car till I die, and then someone else takes it over, even if petrol cars are allowed on the road, then it probably won't even be a problem for them. So I am going to assemble it how it is, and this is how it was from the factory. So the factory, when they changed clutches, didn't change anything here. I don't know what they expected the life of the cars to be, but realistically, I'm not going to be driving it massively high mileages, so that should be fine. I did put the groove in there so that oil can actually get in there, which will help lubricate things. So I think that'll be good. I did also look up in the later parts book to see if it had a gasket in there, and that doesn't mention it either. And this is the parts book for later engines, and it actually has a page specifically for the different gaskets and packings, they call them, and there isn't one there. So I think I'm going to be fine without the gasket. The next issue was this crank came with new keys for everything, but the key did need a little bit of fitting to make it work. And because of that thrust washer in there, I had to take a little bit off the bottom, so that fits in there. It took quite a bit of careful measurement to make sure the height of the key matched the height of the slot in here, so I know it's going to fit together. And I measured that all really accurately first, because this is quite a tight fit on here. I'm going to have to press that home, or actually what I'll do is I'll heat this up in my little toaster oven so it just slips home. But I need to make sure it's not going to bind up on this key when it's in place properly before I do that. So that'll be the next job, I think. And once that is in place, there is the special left-hand thread nut that goes on the end that tightens it all up. There isn't really anything stopping this coming undone apart from the fact that the crank is going that way round, so it's always going to be trying to tighten itself up. But I'll probably still fit it with Loctite. Just the normal kind, not the never come off kind. With the crank gear heated in the little toaster oven, it just slipped straight on. So that was no problem at all. It just literally slid nicely into place. Didn't bind up on the wood rough key. I did use a little bit of Loctite bearing fit stuff just around the key, just to make sure that was a nice tight fit in there. And I've set it up now and measured the end float, and it is on 2000. So I think that's all nice. The crank obviously rotates. It's probably fairly obvious mentioning this, but you have to be a bit careful when you're rotating the crank by putting your hand in there and turning it, because you get a little bit of stiction because I've got oil on everything. So you try and move it, and then all of a sudden it rotates, and it's very easy to squish your hand between the webs on the crankshaft and the side of the crankcase. Don't ask me how I know that. But it looks pretty good now. So I think the next step might be turn it over and fit the flywheel, although I'm wondering if it's better now to start fitting the rods and make sure all of that lines up again. Obviously it should, because I've test assembled this so many times. If we look down, so the crank webs should of course line up with the holes in the block. Yeah, I'm really not sure what the next step is going to be. The other thing I need to do is, I'm sure I ordered long bolts for the oil pump, which I can't find at the moment. I've put them somewhere safe, obviously, and they're obviously a bit too safe. So I need to find those, and then I could bolt the oil pump on. I think you just put a little bit of oil around this seal just to get that to seal. But I guess the next step will be put the intermediate gear in place and make sure it meshes with this and everything turns nicely. And there's no tight spots or anything like that. No idea how you would fix it if there were. There's no adjustment in here at all, so I'm assuming it's going to be fine. On the Austin 7 for the timing gears, they use match pairs, and so it's common when somebody's building an engine from parts these days is to go through piles of different gears to try and get a nice matching set with the right sort of backlash. I don't exactly have a lot of choice here, so I just have to hope it fits together and rotates. Have the intermediate gear in place now. It takes a little fiddling just to make sure that when this drops down, because the gears are on an angle, as it drops down onto the gear, it rotates slightly, so you have to find the right position so that that locating pin goes into the hole and is actually in the hole and isn't just loose. It wasn't too hard. You also have to rotate the crank so that these flats are in line with the gear, otherwise it can't quite clear the circular sides. So that's in place now, and there is backlash there. Like I say, I have no idea what that's supposed to be, or if it's a problem, if it means the engine's rattly. The gear teeth themselves don't look like they're actually worn out. This is a new gear anyway. This is just the one I had, which is what I have to make it work with. You can get new ones of these, so maybe there is a value for what that backlash should be. The good thing is, again, being careful I don't crush my hand. It does rotate nicely. It's just the plastic container falling off. So it goes through its whole motion. There's no tight spots, so that backlash seems to be consistent throughout this whole rotation. It's not binding up anywhere. The oil pump still works, so I think that's good. When I fit the cam gears, you have to make sure that the gears are all in line, so this is all flush across here. Okay, another little detail I need to sort out when it comes time to put the front cover on is you can see the intermediate gear just sits on that shaft. It just sort of moves up and down on it. But once the Loctite's in there, that'll tie those two together. But you still need something to take up the thrust on here. And the way that works, if I can find it, is on the front cover, there's that sort of housing thing in the middle, that sort of black part. And if we put that on there, so with the front cover in place, I don't think we'll really be able to see it, but I can move that gear up and down a fair bit. So I believe what I'm going to need to do is put a shim or some sort of washer inside there to take up that end play. Because I imagine otherwise what would happen is as you go on and off the throttle, I imagine that gear could move up and down, and that would probably affect your timing. I guess the valve timing, would it actually make enough of a difference to be a problem? I don't really know, but having that rattling around in there definitely doesn't seem correct. So I believe there is something that's supposed to go in there. I don't think it's an actual thrust bearing type arrangement, so I need to look that up, figure out what I need to do there. At least this bit is easy to take on and off and get to, so as long as I get it correct before the engine's running, it should be fine. With the front cover just sitting in place, you can now see how the great lump of a dynamo fits on there. I found out that I could get 2BA, 4BA, can't remember exactly, screws locally from radio spares. So I bought some of those to be able to screw the end covers back on. And this is heavy, but you can see how that matches up with the driving dog on the end of the dynamo. And this is just a test fit of the camshafts and the cam gears. They just have big bushes, big bronze bushes that the shaft runs in at this end. You have to make sure you get those the right way around because the oil holes are in different places in them. Also, you need to get the camshafts the right way around, but I can tell on this one because the inlet cam has a slot on the end of it, which is for driving a mechanical tachometer, which is something I'm going to need to look out for and try and find from somewhere. So the drive for that actually goes in the back here, and there's sort of a slotted thing, so there must be some special kind of dog that fits in there to run the mechanical tach. But you can see with these in place how the face of the gears is all flush. So I think that means I have the right random set of gears and spacers and thrust bearings and all of that kind of thing to make this work. So theoretically this should all turn. So that seems to... Oh, I engine stand's moving. That seems to rotate quite nicely. My little gimbal ran out of battery power because I keep forgetting to turn it off. This is the clutch and flywheel. The flywheel, it's all been balanced, and the engineer who did it for me had a look at the inside of the flywheel and suggested a slight skim on that. So they've done that for me. They've machined that face and the lip of the flywheel to match. You can see there's a little bit of pitting in there, but nothing that's really going to worry me or affect things too much. You can see where they had to drill the balance holes in the different clutch components, and a little tiny one there. And these are the little bearings. The balls on these are a bit knackered. The races are okay. They're little bronze cages, and I do have new balls to go in there, 3/16 ball bearings. So when I assemble all of this, I'm going to replace that. The first issue though is getting the flywheel on. And when I took this to be balanced, I completely forgot to take them the keys, which was a bit annoying. So they had to make me a key, even though I've got 3 of them here, 3 new ones. But at least I know this key will fit perfectly because they would have balanced it all with the key in place. So the next trick is getting the flywheel on. And luckily, Mr. Tweed has just done a film on this in the last few days. So I was watching that to see how he did it. And the problem, of course, is there is a big... this is the nut that holds the flywheel on. That ends up inside there when you do everything up, and there's actually a bearing that fits in there. And the issue is this needs to be done up to about 145 foot-pounds of torque. And to be able to do that, you obviously have to stop the crank from turning. So the suggested way is to put a block of wood inside the crankcase between the crank webs and the side of the crankcase, but you do risk cracking something or damaging something. Although that is what I did to do up that front nut there, to get that done up tightly. But what Mr. Tweed did is made up a plate that will bolt on here with 3 little pieces of angle iron to act as teeth, and they will engage with the starter ring gear on the flywheel and stop it turning. So I think I'm going to have to make up something like that as well. What I will do is when I fit the flywheel, I'll heat this up. I'll have to do that in our big oven, not my little toaster oven. Heat it up to expand it, because you really want that tight on that taper. But I think I'll do a quick test assembly just to make sure there's enough clearance around everything. So hopefully that taper is correct and it'll sit the flywheel at the correct position here, but I don't know what that measurement is. I'm guessing it's not hugely critical. I mean, it has to be within, fractions of an inch, I guess, but I'm not sure how much difference it would make if it's, a 16th of an inch out, or I'm not really going to know until I assembled it all and the gearbox is on it and I can see if the clutch works. This is the flywheel just sitting loosely on the taper, although tight enough to turn it, obviously. And this is where having this style of engine crane is really handy. It means I can rotate the engine to be this way up, and it's going to make fitting the flywheel and clutch so much easier. But knowing how far it comes down here is interesting. I've never seen one of these engines assembled, so this is the first time I've worked on one of these I don't know what looks normal. And I've not pulled one of these apart. I got it as a pile of parts. But what I do have is, this was the engine that came with the parts car. It didn't actually have a flywheel attached. I don't think it had a flywheel attached. But I do have a spare flywheel in my pile of parts. So I have, obviously it's a little bit rusty, I wire brushed the taper on the inside, and I've just tapped it home on the taper with a hammer, just lightly. I believe these will pull up quite a bit when you actually torque them up. But with it just sitting there, which should effectively mean it's in the same position as the other engine, I do get the same sort of gap. It's about 3/4 of an inch gap here. So given this is an original crank and an original flywheel with the correct taper, I think that means what I've got on mine, where it's a new crank and a modified flywheel to match the new taper on the back of it, I think the positioning is correct. So obviously when I took that to be machined, I took the engineer who did it, the old crank and flywheel, so he was able to measure everything to figure out the right relationship and machine the right taper for me. So that's looking pretty good, I think. I think that's actually correct. Interestingly, with this on, there's no nut holding it, it's just the friction on the taper. But the crank in this does spin, so that's good to know. Don't know if there's end float in it, it's probably a bit gummed up. But I think I'm in the ballpark anyway. This is an interesting little fact, I guess, on engines. That when you turn an engine off, it's likely to stop in certain positions. I'm guessing it'll stop with one of the cylinders on the compression stroke, which means it's always going to be stopping in the same places. So the flywheel is always going to be in one of a number of places when you restart the engine. And you can actually see it on this one because it's so worn out. You can see where some of the teeth are completely unworn, and then you get to certain points. I think there's two places basically, because it's a 4-cylinder, 4-cycle engine. I'm guessing these will be 180 degrees apart where the wear is. Yep. And you can see how this is worn out in here because the engine's always stopping in one of these two positions. So when you restart it, the starter gear is always going to engage with the same teeth on the flywheel. It's just really obvious on this one because of the amount of wear. I mean, the teeth are almost halfway gone. So luckily the one I'm using isn't quite so bad. I figured out the answer to the question of how far am I going to get before I get stuck. I've got stuck. So I've only loosely attached the flywheel at the moment. It's just sitting there with the nut on it so it doesn't fall off, but it makes it easier for me to rotate the engine when I'm installing the pistons and the rods. Installing the pistons in one of these engines is a little bit of a pain because they're long stroke but very small bore, which means the rods won't actually fit down the bores. So the only way you can assemble them is to insert the rods from underneath, and then you have to take off the big end cap so that you can pull the rod all the way out of the block far enough that you can then manage to put the piston on and get the gudgeon pin through. It's all very, very fiddly because you kind of have to line things up and tap this home to get everything into place. And only then are you able to actually fit the piston rings and feed the pistons back into the block. So it's a bit tricky. The reason I'm stuck is because these gudgeon pins are held with small circlips, and this is what I've got over here. These are all the rings. There's 2 normal rings and then an oil ring. But I've only got 3 sets of circlips, which means I can't finish this off tonight or tomorrow. I'll have to order some. I'll have to figure out what size they are and see if I can get some. The other problem with these is, if it'll focus, I don't actually have a pair of circlip pliers with pins small enough to fit those. They're very tiny. So fitting these could be a bit of a pain. Getting them in might not be too bad because you can compress them up and sort of push them into the hole. But if I can get ones that'll fit my circlip pliers, it'll be much easier. So that's basically where I'm at. I'm going to fit the last piston. I've got all the caps done up basically finger tight. There's oil everywhere. I'm keeping everything extremely clean but extremely well oiled, which is another reason why I don't film everything as I'm doing it, because it's just too tricky, it's too messy. So I'll fit the last piston, and with everything done up loosely, I can at least check that the pistons go up and down, everything clears the block. I'm pretty confident it all will, because of course I've done a test assembly of this before. So this isn't the first time I've assembled this. I'm reassembling everything in exactly the same order. It's worth pointing out that these Arrows cranks, connecting rods, sorry, actually have numbers stamped on them here. They're a numbered set, so they're actually stamped H1 to H4. So I've made sure I've got the numbers correct. So H1 at the front going to H4 at the back. They're all facing the same direction. I don't believe they're actually directional. The pistons aren't directional, but I've made sure everything's gone back how it was when I test assembled it. So I'll get this last piston in and just check everything still turns over. And then I guess I'll have to figure out what the circlips are and order some of those. Hopefully I can order those online. And the next job would then be fitting the piston rings and lowering the piston and conrod back down the holes back onto the crank. So far though, everything is lining up beautifully. So there's no binding. I've got the right sort of clearances either side of the big ends on the connecting rod. So everything's working pretty well there. The engine stand is working beautifully, so being able to tip it up and rotate it to any angle is really, really handy. And that aluminium pan there is just to collect all the oil that's dripping out of it, because as I say, I'm saturating everything in just plain engine oil. I do have assembly grease, assembly lube somewhere, but I think just clean oil is going to be fine for this. That pan's just held in place with a couple of old hard drive magnets. It works really well. So I'll finish the last piston, and then I think that's where I'll have to stop for the day. It would be interesting. I know somebody who watches these films has a Model T Ford. I have no idea what the engines in that are like, and if they have this same issue where you can't insert the piston and the rod through from the top of the block. It's always interesting when you're watching US-based engine assembly films, and they're building all those V8 engines, and the pistons are just, so round. You can assemble the piston and the rings and the rod and just drop them through from the top, which must make it a lot easier. So that's basically where I've got up to, is waiting for those circlips. But with all 4 of the pistons in place, everything rotates nicely. So I can stop this from moving. Look around here. You can see how domed the pistons are to fit into the head, the hemispherical head, and you can see why with 1/8 of an inch longer rods I needed to machine the little step in the top of the piston, as well as the, it's a bit hard to see, but the 45-degree angle flats for where the valves go. So that's all rotating nicely. If you're wondering why I didn't check the big end clearances and things like that, it's because I've done it before. I used Plastigauge previously just to check everything was correct. I wouldn't expect it to be wrong, given this was a new crankshaft and a new set of rods to match it. So if that wasn't correct, there would be something really seriously wrong happening. I did also at one point have to relieve the bottom of the cylinders. It's again a bit hard to see, but you can see the crank rods, because of their sideways travel, get really close to the bottom of the cylinders. So I did have to put some relief in there. And the original engine that came with the car, when I first got it off Joss, the engine had been rebuilt, but never really assembled properly, and it wouldn't turn over. And that was why it wasn't turning over. It was because the conrods were hitting the bottom of the cylinders. So they just needed a little bit of relieving there to make sure they clear. Obviously that's way down the bottom of the cylinder, so it's well away from the bottom of the piston skirts or anything like that. So I guess order circlips, and then once the pistons and rings are inserted and the circlips on the gudgeon pins, I think the next job to tackle will be mounting the flywheel. And for that I will make up that little plate, which is something I can do while I'm waiting for the circlips to arrive. The rest of it looks good. The oil pump looks like it'll work. The timing gear looks like it'll work. The camshafts fit in there nicely. I think I do have to remember to fit the tappets before I fit the camshafts. I think the tappets need to go in. Oh, hopefully the tappets don't need to go in before the crankshaft. But no, it looks like there's room inside there to get up inside there and get things in place. And again, this is where being able to tip the engine up is going to be a real advantage, because I can sit it so that the cylinder head is down effectively and just drop the tappets into the holes and then install the crankshafts. And then I think once that's done, I can start looking at the head, which is up over here. The valves are in it, and I should really look at measuring the combustion chamber volumes. I've got that burette. That was another job I was going to do that I never quite got to. And then I will assemble all of the rocker gear with the best parts I've got in the rocker cover boxes there. Then I think that's mainly it. The actual engine ancillary things, so down there I've got the fuel pump, the starter motor and the dynamo, which I've rebuilt. I've rebuilt all three of those. They're ready to go. The carburetors should be ready to go. They're all rebuilt. The only thing I haven't looked at is that there, which is the magneto. And there is a chap who advertises in the Vintage Car Club magazine here who rebuilds magnetos. So I'm suspecting it's probably worth me getting in touch with him and just getting the thing rebuilt. I can't imagine it's going to be cheap, but I think it's probably going to be worth it in the long run. And I think that's really everything at the moment. Oh, one other thing, I'm still playing with the switch panels. There's another one, I'm printing another one at the moment, just playing with that. This is how they're sort of looking at the moment. These are just some brass countersunk screws I had that I nickel plated, and I'm still waiting for the potentiometer. I'll print out a decent knob for that. I did get this starter switch, so this was effectively new old stock replacement for a Lucas starter switch. CI, nice old box. These are mini or early Land Rover floor starter buttons. So normally there'd be a sort of kick button for that. So it's quite a strong spring. It takes quite a bit of pressure to push on it, but it does have a threaded end. So I should just be able to make a knob that fits on that. That looks like the Riley ones. I'm not going to run the full starter motor current through this. I'd rather have this switching a relay, but that can actually be a problem with some of these switches because I think some of these bigger switches are designed to have current going through them to help clean the contacts. So if you don't have enough current through them, I think it can cause problems. I'm not sure if that would affect this switch or not. It's been sitting unused, obviously, for years, and it works. There's connectivity when you press the button. So maybe it'll be fine. It's just going to be one of those things where it's a matter of trying it out and seeing what happens. I think my other print of one of these should almost be finished. Basically, I just changed the settings so that it prints full, so it's solid plastic. So obviously I'm going to have to do a bit more sanding and polishing, but the finish of them isn't too bad. It looks more like Bakelite than painted metal, but it's good enough to look sort of right. I did miss out on eBay. Somebody sent me an email and pointed out an auction on eBay for a Riley Brooklands instrument panel. And it wasn't the switch, it wasn't one of these, but it was a speedometer, a clock, a ammeter, and an oil pressure gauge. And the starting price was only £200, which is cheap. And I did bid on it, but unfortunately I've never really bid on something on eBay before. So in New Zealand we've got our own auction site, Trade Me, which is what we use. So eBay's never been a big thing in New Zealand. And the only times I've used it in the past, either I was the only person bidding on something or I was doing, a buy now type thing. So I didn't realize that the auctions don't auto extend when it gets to the end. So I got beaten right at the last second, literally the last couple of seconds. In New Zealand, it doesn't work that way, because if there's a bid in the last few seconds, the auction will just extend, and it'll just keep extending if somebody puts in last minute bids. So everyone's got a chance. So I missed out on that, but I suspect, I don't know what it would have gone for, but somebody got a real bargain on that because I didn't realize how it worked, unfortunately. But that's okay. Things come and go. I actually already have a suitable CAV ammeter. I have a chronometric tachometer, chronometric speedometer that I've rebuilt in the past, which will be fine and is period correct. It would be nice to get a period correct oil pressure gauge. I've got something that's fairly suitable, the right sort of period. It's just not the exact right sort of instrument. But again, it's one of these things where if you start looking at pictures of Brooklands, including supposedly original Brooklands, you'll find no two of them have the same instrument panel. A lot of them have different gauges fitted or modern switches, modern gauges. It's just a total mismatch of bits and pieces. So as long as I've got something that is period correct, I think it'll be fine.